Okay, good morning. So we are on the bottom of Tesvav and Beis. I'm going to try to run through today Tezayin and Aleph to get to the mission. Okay, says the Gemara. We are um, um, about Tanur Reb Oshia. It's about 10 or so lines from the bottom. Two dots. Tanur Reb Oshia, Kamei de Rav. So you may be wondering why we're bringing up this Reb Oshia. If you look at the Reb Nissim Gaon, the Sefer Maftech on the side, he adds in Oshia, but there was versions of it that said Yeshaya, which would then make sense because the Gemara before talked about Tevi Amar Rabbi Shaya. So it says the Gemara, Tanur Oshia, Kamei de Rav. The Rabbi Oshia said in front of Rav of Savtam. The pasuk says in the end of Shema of Savtam, Am Zayis Beisecha of Savtam. So what does that tell us? Hakol B'Sav. When you're writing over a mezuzah, you have to say over the whole thing inside of it. Why? Uksav Tom. It has to be a ksiva Tom. It has to be the full amount of this parsha. What might have you thought to say? I feel you might have thought to say just the substantive part. But you might not have thought it has to be the whole parsha. I feel tzavos, even the commands, the procedural aspects of the parsha that tell you have to write down even the commands of Saptam Am the command has to also be written. The Amar Lei, the Amar Chamani, so Rava says, who told you this part? Like, why are you thinking that this is something that needed to be taught? Like, what else might you have thought? Rabbi Yehudi must be because of the position of Rabbi Yehuda, because we have insight that teaches us the following. The more there insight that tells us, the Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Gabi Soita, Olois, Koisev, Savois, Ena Koisev. What happens by a Soita? The Torah tells us that you have to write down Parsha Soita. Right? You have to write down, because it's called Olois, Se'ela, right? What is the kinds of clause that she's going to get, that what she has done wrong, that Spitnech Tzava, right? Esirechech Nefeles, all the different punishments of a Soita. So Rabbi Yehuda says that what do you write down by a Soita? You write down the Olois, the fact that she's going to have all these things, terrible things happen to her if she was guilty. But you don't write down the part that says because of us always. You have to write down the always. That's not what's written down. You just write down the substantive, the curses. Says the Gemara. The Amar Lachman Yehudi. The Amar Gabi said the always kaisev tzavois and a kaisev a hatzam who dichsev. Over there says Rava. What does it say in pasuk? Because of us always say. Over there it says in pasuk, write down the curses. It doesn't say write down the fact that it says write down. So obviously write down the curses. I don't need to tell me a word from Uksavta that tells you Ksiva Tama. You have to write down a full Ksiva. No, not a full Ksiva. You write down Uksav Tom, you write down the substantive aspects by definition. The only reason that you would consider only writing down the substantive aspects and not the whole parsha would be because of the fact that the Torah directed it specifically, but it didn't. By Saita, it specifically directed it. Because of us you should write down the curses. So that's why you wouldn't write down the procedural aspects, the fact that it says to write down. But by Shema, it doesn't have it. So since by Shema it doesn't have it, so v'hasamu the civil kosvas ela v'hacha the civil saptam afil tzavois nami. Right. So over here where you don't have it says you only write down the olis. Over here it says saptam, so it'll include even the tzavois. So the point that we are making is that you don't need to have the special limud of saptam when I have a pasuk very clearly by Saita that says because of es kol ha'alois sa'ela, which limits it to just the alois and not to the whole parsha. Says the Gemara, no, atu taimid Rabbi Yehuda mishum nefsiv v'chasav. You're telling me that the reason that according to Rabbi Yehuda that you're going to say that you only write down the alois is because it says v'chasav. There's nothing to do with it. Rabbi Yehuda mishum nefsiv alois and savois loy. So if that's the case, that reason that you say the olos is only because it says because of us olos, that's why you don't have to write down the whole parsha. Over here where it doesn't have that, so pashut, you would write down the whole parsha. It's not limited. I don't need to have a special limit from Mechsavt that tells you ksiva tama. It's not being mamayet. There's no limitation like it has by the olos. To answer the Gemara. So then, what is the need for this limit of Rabbi Ishia telling you that Mechsavt and ksiva tama? I don't need it. Pashut. I have a limitation over there by Parsha Sodik. It says because of Eskola Ola Seila. So over there, since it's limited out in that, I understand. I end up with a situation where I'm going to just have writing down the curses. But over here by Shema, I'm not have that limitation. So I don't have the limitation. I write down the whole thing. That's Rava's question to Rabbi Ishia. I'm sorry, I don't see that you really need this. So what does the Gemara answer? Says the Gemara, no, there is a reason that I do need the Ksavtam. Why is that? Says the Gemara, it's I should learn out like a Gzer Shava, Ksiva. What is the Gzer Shava going to be? Ma hasam alois en tzavois loy avhacha nami tzavois loy kasav avhacha nami tzavois loy. So too, you wouldn't do the tzavois over here. So kasav rachman oksavtam afilu tzavois. In other words, says the Gemara as follows. It's true. By Parshas Soitek says the cost of Eskola Olois Eila, and therefore it's limited to just the Olois. However, if I didn't have Uchsavtam and I just had the Kosav, then I might have made a Gezer Shava of a Kosav that it said by Shema to the Kosav that it said by Soita. And since by Soita it was limited to the Olois, so too by Shema will be limited to just the substantive parts of the Parsha. Meaning, but I wouldn't write down the tzavah that you have to write down the command uchsaftam to write down the actual uchsaftam hamazos b'sech. I wouldn't actually write that down. So therefore, I had the plus of uchsaftam instead of just v'chosav to teach you ksiva tama that you have to write down the whole parsha of the Shema, even the tzavos. That is the vart. That is the line here of. That is the line here of the Rabbi Yishai. That's what he's teaching us. Again, I think that's the connection of why we're bringing in this Gemara over here, because probably it sounded like Rabbi Yishai, which would be from the Gemara before. Now we have something related to our Haftarah this week. Tani Rabbi Vadia, right? The Haftarah for this week, Parash Vayishlach, the shortest parak in all of Tanakh, one parak. The Vadia the Ger. So I guess his name was used, right? So Tani Rabbi Vadia Kamei the Rava, another vart that is being taught in front of Rava. This one has very much to do with the Mishnah, though. The Mishnah told us, right? If you remember the Mishnah Tezvav, the Mishnah told us, "Karavulay diktek ba'isi yisei was machlekes Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda." Here, Rabbi Yossi was mego. Rabbi Yossi said you're yaitzer. Rabbi Yehuda said you weren't yaitzer. Right? What does it mean? You're not being medactic. You're being megamgam. You're sort of like running over words. You're not being very clear. So this Gemara is very, very practical halach, and that's why here sometimes you hear people when they say over the Shema, they say it over very precisely. It's because of this next Gemara. Tana Rabbi Vadia, Kamei de Rava, Ulmaratem. When the pasuk says Ulmaratem, what does it mean? It sounds like you should be teaching your kids. We learn out from this an additional point. That your teaching should be clear, should be complete. What do you mean? You should put spaces between the things that are close together, between the things that are attached together. That happens to also be related to this week's parsha, right? Yaakov Avinu says to the shepherds when they're going to bring over the present to Esav that he should be placing a revach tasimu bein eder vein eder. Why should he put a revach, a space, to make the present seem bigger? If you put all the sheep and the camels and everything together and tightly, then Esav wouldn't appreciate the magnanimity, the generosity of Yaakov. You space them out, you make them apart. So it looks like, wow, one present. More presents. Wow, so many presents I'm getting. So that's how you should read the Parsha of Shema, with a revach. You should make it with a space between the words, not to be megamgem, not to be going run on words. Why? Because what's the problem if you have it? Ani Rava Basri. Rava agrees with this one, and Rava says, "Kegoin alav avecha." Right? Notice the lamed and the lamed are connected. All right, alav avecha sounds like what? Sounds like it's one. It's going to become one word. It's one lamed. Alav avecha doesn't. You're not making a separation to make two lameds. So all these are similar examples. Alav avecha, alav avchem, chol avchem, chol avchem, eisa b'sodecha, v'avanata mehera, hakanaf sil, escha me'eretz. Right. These are all the similar examples because they all have the ending with the same letter as the beginning of the next word, and that's why you have to put a revach between these kinds of words. Amar Rav Chama Rav Chanina. Rav Chama Rav Chanina says, "Kol hakeri kriya Shema medaktek ba'isi yisrael." Whoever reads the Shema and is medaktek in the words, right, very very carefully, he says over the Shema correctly. Mitzanan loy gehenim. You make Gehenim colder for this guy. How do you know they make Gehenim colder for this guy? Because the pasuk says, "B'fares Shaddai Malachim." When Hashem is going to scatter, spread around the kings, Tishalek b'Salmain. Right? It's going to be snow in Salmain. So what does that have to do with anything? No, it has absolutely nothing to do with anything of what we just said, and without Reb Chaim Rechanina's drasha. So this is how you read it. Al tikri befares. Don't read it befares that were spread, that were scattering around the kings. Ella befaresh. Rather, when we are explaining befaresh. So now read the pasuk again. Befaresh Shaddai Melachim. But when you're going to be clearly explaining Shaddai, meaning the Rebbeinu Shalom, and you're going to be clearly enunciating out the psukim of the Shema, so then Teshalik b'Salmain, then it'll be snow in Salmain. Al tikri b'Salmain el b'Salmavis. Read it as not Salmain but Salmavis, meaning in death, meaning you have snow in your death. What does that mean? You have snow in the death. It means you will have a cool death, meaning Gehenna will become colder for you because you had kavana, say the words correctly, appropriately in Shema. Important to notice this Taisus over here in the bottom. Taisus ben Advekim. Of Alphas Mosif, as they point out in Mishpat, it's not really in the Rif. We don't have this version of the Rif, but the Rif adds in a few additional points. We're saying now that we have to be medactic very carefully when the letters have the ending of a letter of a word has the same as the beginning of the next word. So Al Lavavecha as an example. The Lamed ends the word and the Lamed begins the word. So you have to be careful there. So the Rif adds on other examples that are not necessarily so as obvious, but they sound the same. So the Rif says Kigon Bechara Af. Right, Bechara Af is not the same. One's a hey, one's a aleph. But if you don't say it carefully, then it becomes Becharaf, right? Which means like Chir V'Gida, if you don't want to say something like that. Bechein says Taisus, Meisef V'Reisem Meisoi, right? Uzchartem Es, Vasisem Es. So Tzorach Litem Revach Bein Mem Shebeseif Tevel Alpha Shebetchilas Tevel, because it's like a mem and an aleph, which could be again mished together. So you have to make again a space between them. Bechein. And this is the one fun part, right? Because everybody must have heard the people when they said Shema and they were kids. It'll be Laman Kiru, right? You heard those guys? So how did this come about? So Taisa says, "V'chein lahatis zayin shel sizkru." You have to put in the clarity of the zayin of tiskru. Why? Shel yishma sin, right? So because if it sounds like if you say Laman tiskru, right? So why are you saying that you want to do the mitzvahs Laman tiskru? So you should get schar. You should get a lot of schar. And that's a problem. Why? We're not supposed to be doing mitzvahs to get schar. So really, you have to be careful to say leman tizguru. But again, the man tizguru is not. There's limitations on how far one has to go. Okay. So next Gemara, but this relates at least to this what we just said in the Mishnah, that somebody should be leaning, he should be doctic by Yisrael. If he's not a machlokes, we have it to make and say you're yotzi, even if you're not medactic. Because like we said already in the Gemara before on Tezvah, we told us that we're mekel with both Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda in each situation. One is machmer and one is mekel. We go with a mekel in each case. But nevertheless, ideally one should do that. And the Gemara here is saying, Rabbi Chaim Rechanina is saying that if somebody does that, they're going to make a henem cooler for him. All right, continues the Gemara. Another Gemara now from Rabbi Chaim Rechanina. But now we're getting to Tezayin Amud Aleph. Rabbi Chaim Rechanina lo menisbekul ayaholim lenechalim. Why does Ayaholim and Achalim come together? Right, you have to go now to think about the parsha of Balak. Again, we're by the parsha of Balak. What is the parsha of Balak? The parsha of Balak is Matzevu Alecha Yaakov Mishnesecha Yisrael Kinechalim Nitoyu Kiganois Aleinahar Ka'alim Natashem Karozim Aleimoyim. A very beautiful prayer by Bilam. He's talking about the Jewish people. So Kinechalim Nitoyu, right, the streams that are spread out there. Like the gardens by the river, right, the cedars by the water. It's very, very beautiful. And the Jewish people are so wonderful. They're so planted. They're so special. Very nice. So the Gemara says, and this limit has nothing to do with anything about Shema, but we're saying a vart. What's the vart? The vart is, Rabbi Chaim Chanin is asking, why is it that Ayaholim and Nechalim are next to each other? Again, they're not literally next to each other. Look at the pasuk. It says, Ki Nechalim nitoyu, ki ganis aleinor, ka'alim nata Hashem. So they're all similar, right? The Ki Nechalim is like the ka'aholim. It's all part of the same poetic expression. Loim Lachos is to teach you. Ma Nechalim al mitum l'tayra, just like a nachal, right? It could be used as a mikvah. right? You go to a creek, it could be used as a mikvah, and it will take somebody from becoming from who is tamei and make him tar. So af ahalim malanas adam mikaf chayv lekaf schus. So too, somebody who's guilty, the oil is going to bring him to schus. What do you mean the oil is going to bring him to schus? It explains Rashi. Tab Rashi there af ahalim, but the midrashes. We're talking about the base of Medrash, right? What do we say about Yaakov? Yaakov ishtam yoshev ahalim. That's what oil. Oil is the is learning, and oil is bringing schus to somebody the same way that a mikveh would to somebody as well. I should point out the top Taisvis. Taisvis says, "Perish akunjis tasiv kinachal nitoy ka'al nata." So it says Taisvis v'li nira da'ihalim da'haikra lav lashon oil. That ihalim is not a lashon of oil, rather el lashon besamim. It's a lashon of besamim. What do you mean a lashon of besamim? El nira ben nesamach ma'ateva alecha l'chanachal nitoy. So Taisa says that Ayhalim is not a lashon of an Ayhel, it's a lashon of Besamim, right? As the Taisa Rosh points out, Taisa Rosh says that the pasuk says more of the Ayhalis, right? It is there's a pasuk in what do you call in Shir Hashirim that talks about the more, the Besamim and the tents. So it could be a lashon of Besamim that it's talking about. Fine. I should also note that that when the what do you call the when the Taisus is telling you here another pshat in what the oil is it an actual oil like a base medrash, or is it an oil that's a reference here to Besamim? And then if you look in Rashi in Parshas Balak, so Rashi in Parshas Balak brings you up both pshatim. Rashi in Parshas Balak brings you up both. Rashi tells you that what does it mean, ali moyim, etc. So one pasuk Rashi says kitar gumay lashon marva. Taisus doesn't here bring down that this is the targum, but Taisus' pshat is the targum onkelos. Taisus doesn't say that, right? This Taisus is not telling you that it's the targum, but it's a targum. Rashi brings that one of his pshatim is like the targum. Another pshat Rashi says is the base medrash. So we have in Rashi Chumash bringing down a bunch of pshatim, and Rashi here not saying it. Why not? Taisus is disagreeing with Rashi. Is Rashi picking a side? No. Clearly Rashi and Chumash is telling you both. So one of the things that one has to understand when one reads the Gemara and one reads Rashi and Chumash, you will find many times that Rashi and Chumash is saying something that doesn't sound like what he's explaining in the Gemara. It's not a stira. Rashi in the Gemara is explaining what he thinks of the Pashup Pshat in the Gemara. Rashi and Chumash explain what he thinks of the Pashup Pshat in the Pasuk and Chumash. The Pashup Pshat in the Chumash doesn't have to be the Pashup Pshat in the Gemara. Right? You have a way of explaining the Chumash. It could be 6 Gemaras, 10 Midrashim. When Rashi is explaining to the Gemara, he's explaining to what's in front of him. Just the Gemara. He's not bringing up 16 Midrashim. That's not the point of Rashi. Rashi's point is explaining what's in front of you. So it's not a stira. Rashi and Chumash has in front of him 6 Gemaras and 10 Midrashim. Then he's telling you what he thinks is a Pshat. But not Rashi and Gemara. So you can't ask as a question on Rashi. Rashi is trying to explain to you this, and it happens to be this is a great example of it because Rashi clearly doesn't disagree with Taisvis. In Chumash, he's bringing down the same exact pshat as Taisvis, but over here he's only using one because that's what he thinks the Pashup Pshat in the Gemara. Okay, so this is a life lesson in terms of understanding how to learn Rashi. All right, continues the Gemara. Akur l'mafreya. Now you remember we already explained Akur l'mafreya back on Yud Gimel, right? When the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, the beginning of the Gemara had said this machlokes between Rabbi and Chachamim. We talked about what do the Chachamim hold. Well, the Rabbanan nami haksiv v'hayu. So what do the Rabbanan do with v'hayu? Right. So they said, you're not allowed to read backwards. What does it mean backwards? So Rashi said, if you look at the Rashi, mean devarim hadvarim. Rashi said, what does it mean loyal mafreya? You go into v'sharecha beisecha mezuzos. You read the words backwards. So as I may have mentioned then, but if you look in Shulchan Aruch, when we are talking about what we say reading backwards, there's the differences between reading backwards the parshias versus reading back the psukim versus reading backwards the words. Right? 3 different ways that you could read backwards. Some made a mistake on the parshias is fine. Right? But if somebody's reading the words backwards or the psukim backwards, that's when of course it's not going to be possible. It's nonsensical. So the way the Shulchan Aruch reads in Orach Chaim Samach and Dalet, and To read this after the Gemara, before the Gemara, it's the same thing. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Karl Mafreya lo yotza. If somebody reads the Shema backwards, he's not yotza. Amed dvar mamburim beseder psukim. If somebody reads the psukim backwards, forget the words. Of course, the words are not yotza. But even if you read the psukim backwards, you're not yotza. Avalim hiktim parsha lechaverta. But if you read one parsha of Shema before the other one, Afal pish and rashai, even though you really shouldn't do that, yotza, nevertheless, it's still yotza. Why? Lefish ain't a smuchal of a term, because it's not in the Torah. In fact, to the contrary, right? Vayemer is before everything, right? As we already pointed out, the Taisus above, right? Taisus said, "Ain't mukta mocha." Remember Taisus in Tesvav base, top Taisus. Taisus said, "Ain't mukta mocha." That's what we're able to do out of order. Otherwise, you would think you should do it in the right order. So we don't care about. We do care. You should say the parashas in the order that we have them. But if you didn't, you're still yaitza. But the psukim, to mess around with the psukim and say one before the other one, that doesn't go in the right order, then of course that doesn't work at all. So that's one point. Now the second point we're going to see here in the Gemara. It says the Gemara, somebody reading the Shema is not yet. Again, I love these stories, right? They're in the middle of telling you about Amgrasi, right, and Rabbi Lezer. They're all students from Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi were preparing a chuppah for Rabbi Lezer's chastan. Rabbi Lezer is the Ramar Da'aretz Eretz Yisrael. He's a great rabbi. They're preparing a chuppah for him for his chasana. So what does Rabbi Lezer say to them? Amar lahu, he says, listen, I appreciate you guys coming making me the chuppah for my wedding. Why don't I go to the base medrash? I'll learn, I'll listen to the shir, and then after the shir, then I'll come and tell you what I heard in the shir. So they say, yeah, good idea, right? You know, somebody's been making a marriage proposal. So sometimes you have people, the friends make it, set it up for them, right? When the guy's busy on the date, so his buddies or whatever setting it up. Fine. So he, instead of going to on a date, he went to learn. So says the Gemara, so he went to the shir, and there was a Tana they was teaching in front of Rabbi Yochanan, right? You remember the Gemara in Ham and Aleph? The bottom of Ham and Aleph, we talked about the Tana Kamed Rabbi Yochanan, right? Again, the Tana is not a Tana, is a Moira, but he's a repeater. He remembers the halakas, and he's saying over a halakha in front of Rabbi Yochanan. So what did he say over that day? Punkt. Kara v'to ve'en yedei lechem to. So he was reading the Shema. He made a mistake, and now he doesn't know where he was. So we have to look at the Haggoyos of the Bach. So he doesn't know where he is. He mamash forgot. So Yachsa l'rosh. He has to go back to the beginning of the Shema. If he has no idea where he is, he has to go back to the beginning. The Emtza haparak. Right? What happens if he forgot in the middle of a parak? Right? In the middle of the parak, he's middle saying V'hayim Shema, for example, and he's like, oh, what was I up to? So Yachsa l'tchesa. Go back to the beginning of that parak. In the middle of Vayomer, you forgot where you are. Go back to Vayomer. Bein parak leparak. What happens if he made a mistake in between the prakim? In other words, he's not sure if he's between Shema V'haya or V'haya Vayomer. Then Yachsel Rosh. Then you should go back to the beginning. As Rashi explains, what does it mean when we're saying Yachsel Rosh? I'm sorry, Ben Perek Yachsel Perek Rishon. Has to go back to the Perek Rishon. As Rashi says, what does that mean? Lahafsik Rishon, Lahefsik Rishon, V'hayim Shema. Has to go back to V'hayim Shema, right? Between Shema, V'hayim, Vayomer. If you're not sure which parak he's at, so he goes back to the first parak, to the first in-between place, and that is V'haya. So he's got to start again from there, right? That by definition. So what happens if being ksiva? What happens if he's confused between the two times he says l'chsaftam? He's not sure which one it is. Is it by the chsaftam of V'haya or the chsaftam of Hafta? So Yachsa l'ksiva rishayna. So then he should go back to the first time it says Uksafta. So Amalei Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan said, Lo yishanu ela shaloi pasak v'leman yirbu yemechem. That's true. In other words, I picture the scene. The Tana Reb said over the halakha. Right? Rabbi Yochanan's the Rosh Yeshiva. Rabbi Yochanan is the one who's the head dog. Right? It's not like the Tana is. He's like their version of a tape recorder. Right? He's not the Rosh Yeshiva. He's saying over, these are the halachas that he remembers. These are the ones that he has memorized. So Rabbi says, okay, you're right, but we have to clarify something. What do we have to clarify? You're saying that if somebody doesn't know which Chsaftam he's at, then he has to go back to the Chsaftam and V'hafta, not the Chsaftam and V'haya. So Rabbi that's only true if he like literally doesn't know where he is, but he knows he's at the Chsaftam, he doesn't know which one. However, if he caught himself that where he is now by Laman, but if he says, I made a mistake by Oksaftam, but he's actually finding himself now, he's saying Laman Yibri Mechem, so then he doesn't have to go back to the Oksaftam and Vahafta, then he goes back to the Oksaftam and Vahaya. Why? Says Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan, Lashon Shalei Pasuk L'man Yibri Mechem. Our Pasuk L'man Yibri Mechem Sarchei Nokta. Right, his routine is what he's saying. Va'asi, Asa va'Amar. Right, I'm sorry. So Sarchei Nokta. He's saying over his routine. So he's this is like we said over the Gemara, right? I told you that the Yerushalmi in the first parak brachas, which brought down in Tosfos and Shabbos and Kufir Ches, that people, sometimes they thank their knees for bowing down by Maidim because people get into routine. They forget to have kavana. So Rabbi Yochanan thinks if somebody found himself in L'man Yibri Mechem, it means he's in Vahaya. He doesn't have to go back to the Ksaftam and Vahaftam. He just has to go back to Vahaya. So says the Gemara, Va'asi Asa Va'amar Lahu. So he comes back to them and he tells them this vart that he heard in the Beis Medrash from Rabbi Yochanan's clarification. So Amrulay. So they said back to him, right? Their version of Dayenu, which is basically, this is such a good word that you told us, shkoyach. So then it was worth it to come and work all day while you were in this year, while we're making you your chuppah. It says Tosfos, the Tosfos says when somebody who's in the middle of saying the Shema, he doesn't know where he is, he made a mistake, so he goes back mamash to the beginning of the whole thing. Perish mitam she'eni yedeh mechan tov, because he has no idea where he is. He wakes up. Was I saying Shema? I have no idea where I am. So then go back to the beginning of Shema if you have no idea where you are. That says aval im hayu yedeh mechan tov shedi like tevay pasuk and it's tzarich lachzar. Elam oiseh pasuk ve'elef chena behal ve'umigila. So it says we're only talking about a situation you have to go back to the beginning if you literally don't know nothing about where you are. But if you have a basic idea of where you were, then you go back to that pasuk. You go back to that area. You don't have to go back all the way to the beginning. Okay, this is the Gemara until here. Continues. Oh, I just wanted to point out that this is in fact how it's brought down la halacha. So the Shulchan Aruch writes there in Orach Chaim Samach Daled, the Shulchan Aruch writes Kar Parsha V'Torah Ba. Somebody reading the Parsha Shema and he makes a mistake in it. So Im Yodea Hechen Tov, he knows where he made a mistake. He got Shekar Kula Shadog Pasuk Achad, and he forgot one pasuk, right? Be'emtza. So then, if he just forgot one pasuk, so then in the halach is he goes Chayzel Rosh Oisa pasuk. Go back to that pasuk. That's this Tosfos here, right? That's exactly this Tosfos. If you have an idea of where you made a mistake, go back to that pasuk. The only time we say Chayzel Rosh, we have no idea where you just woke up, like, oh, I'm saying Shema. So then go back to the beginning of Shema. But if you have a general idea, go back to that pasuk. Then and once if you're just not sure, you know you made a mistake, you know it's in that parsha, but you're not sure exactly where, go back to the beginning of that parsha. If you made a mistake between the parshas, he knows he finished the parsha, but he's not sure exactly which one. So then chayz the parsha rishona, go back to the end of the first parsha, meaning go back to Vayim Shemaya. And then if he was saying Uchsaftim, you go back to the Saftim and V'ahavta of Hanimir. If you said L'man Yirbu, then you would in fact go to V'haya. You wouldn't have to go back to V'ahavta because of the fact that your routine brought you there. Okay, now we have a new sugya. This in part relates to whole sugyas in Bamitzia about workers. And you see how Chazal were so serious about requiring workers to work, not to battle while they were working. Nowadays, it's a davar yadua that everybody has a phone, that everybody's battled during work, and that's not the same kind of responsibility that it once was. But certainly, you can see at least the fidelity, the honesty that Chazal required from a worker. Workers are able to read the Shema when they're on top of a tree or on top of some sort of a pile of stones. But they're not permitted to say Shemona Esrei when they're on top of the tree or on top of the Nidbach. Why not? Because, as Rashi explains, if you look at Rashi, why not? That Tzlus Arachmi, because Shemona Esrei requires, it's for Rachamim, by Kavanah, requires a certain level of concentration. Therefore, you shouldn't be doing this on top of a tree, on top of a pile of stones. The mistafi that we're concerned, dilmanafli, if you're going to have legitimate kavana, if you're going to really be davening for racham, for yourself, for your family, for all of Klal Yisrael, we're afraid you might fall. Right? It's just legitimate dangerous. The ein yichon lamed sham, because it's really not easy to stand on this. Allah yidei atchak, umach must be too, so mechavne. And so what's going to really most likely happen? You're not going to have kavana. Why are you not going to have kavana? Because you're afraid you might fall. But tefillah requires kavana. So you're not permitted to say the Shemona Esrei when you're up in the tree. When you're up in the tree, you can say the Shema, but not the Shemona Esrei. Chasan, Pata Mikriyah Shema Laila Rishon about Motzei Shabbos. So Chasan is Pata from Kriyah Shema the first night until Motzei Shabbos from Le'asa Maisa. Maisa B'Gamliel, we have a story that B'Gamliel, Shenasa Isha V'Kar Laila Rishon. B'Gamliel did say the Shema the first night, right? It boggles the mind. We're talking about Rabbi Gamliel. He got married, and he said Shema. And his students, remember, we're going to have later on the Gemara in Brachot Samach Beis, right? The Rav Kahana went under Rav's bed, right? They followed the people to the bathroom. Right, so they're checking out Rabbi Gamliel when he's getting married to make sure is he saying Shema, and they found out that he's back saying Shema. So they say to him, "I'm like Talmidov, it's his wedding night. Don't hack him." No, they hacked him. Lamaratena Rabbeinu, Rabbi, didn't you teach us Shachas and Patner Kreshma? Amalahem, Eini Shemelachem. He said, "I'm not listening to you." Levatel Hemeni Machal Shamayim Afilu Sha'achas. I'm not listening to you. Did I actually Levatel Machal Shamayim for even a second? No. Not doing it. So he said Shema. What do we do practically as a halachic matter? So Shulchan Aruch Arachayim Siman Ayin says the Shulchan Aruch, the black letter law is Hakanis Apsul Pat Mekriya Shema Gimel Yom Le'asa Maisa. V'neshu Torah Tiras Mitzvah. However, V'hani Milu Bizman Harishayim. Aval Achshav Shegam Shar Bnei Adam En Mechuvan Karoi. Gam Hakanis Apsul Karoi. So nowadays it'll be absolutely egotistical of a chassan say, I can't say Shema. I'm at the level where I have kavana, and today I don't have kavana, so I don't have to say Shema. No. None of us have kavana today, in the requisite way, so we could all say Shema on the night that we get married. That's what it says in Shulchan Aruch. Fine. Tara Rabban and Zak the Gemara, so says the Gemara as follows. Ha'umnin Kairin Bereish Ha'ilon of Rosh Nidbach. Right? Like we just said, that they're able to say the Shema on top of the tree or the pile of stones, but to daven Shemona Esrei, they can't do it in a regular tree. However, they are able to say Shemona Esrei Bereish HaZayis and Bereish HaTa'ina. The specific trees here, the Elon that we're talking about, these Elonis of a Ta'ina, a fig tree, or an olive tree, they have, as Rashi says, they have a lot of leaves. They have, some sort of extra protection that it would be. Rashi says, if you look at the top, Rashi, they have, I guess, a very significant amount of leaf cover. You're able to stand on a fig tree or an olive tree without too much problems. I don't know. The olive trees I've ever seen are all very small, so I'm not really sure I understand that. But maybe when they're allowed to grow much bigger, maybe it's different. Fig trees, I've seen some very big ones with big canopies, so maybe a fig tree is more simple to understand, at least for me. So what we're basically saying is, you're not afraid to fall in that kind of a tree. So therefore, therefore you could stand there and you could daven Shemona Esrei, have kavanah. We're not afraid. You're not afraid of falling. So since you're not afraid of falling, you could have kavanah. But you really shouldn't be davening Shemona Esrei and other trees, because the amount of kavanah that would be required would be impossible to sustain, because you'd be too scared that you might be falling. So again, Tarabanam the current version of Vashan Nidbach Maspal Bersha Zayas Versha but other trees you have to come down to daven the Shemona Esrei. Or Balabayas. And what about the Balabas himself? Benkach Yer Lamata Maspal. The Balabas, he has to come down to daven. He cannot stay up, even in the Ta'ina, even in the Zayas, he cannot stay up. Why? The fish ain't died to me Shavas Alav, because he's the Balabas. He is not going to have his das calm. Says Rashi, he has to be Yered Mispal. He's not a worker. We're not worried about him and being honest to his boss. So he's come down. So he's scared. It's a pilot. If they bit the malacha, why we make go by the pilot? Because they have a job to do. They have to be honest laborers. But it's a baal bias. But we're not going to be making for the baal bus. So I want to be clear about what like kind of level that we're talking about. So the Gemara in Tainus on Chav Gimel and Beis, the Gemara tells us the whole story about Abba Chilkiah and getting the rain. He was related to Chani Amagal, a grandson. Anyhow, the Gemara says the rabbi he made a whole trick on the rabbis. He brought the rain without even being asked for by the rabbis. The rabbi said, "We know your tricks, but in the course of events, when they came to catch him, they caught him in a field, and they spoke to him. They said, Shalom Aleichem, and he ignored them." So the Gemara says that after they were done with him, when the rain came, they asked him a series of questions about his behavior. Maisarav. So they said to him, Yadan de Mitra Machmas Mar, we know that the rain is from you. We want you to explain to us some weird things that you've done. This is my time. Why is it that when we said Shalom Aleichem to you, you ignored us? He says, I was hired for the day. I don't have the permission to talk to you. Shalom Aleichem is too much. Right? Just tell you, as a side note, the Rambam writes that a worker has if he wants to take a second job, right? He wants to have what's it called? A side hustle. It's called, right? He wants to have a side hustle. So the Rambam says, if you're a sachir, let's say you're hired for 8-hour day work, and then you want to work at nights the Rambam says you can't do that because you're going to be tired the next day, right? You're going to be tired the next day. You're not going to be if you're not at full force. What is the solution to all these situations? Huh? No, not to be a hard worker. Disclosure. You have to tell the boss, look, I work 20 hours a day. I'm happy to work for you for 8 hours a day. I also have a side hustle. I work another 8 hours at night. My wife was telling me yesterday we went to the PTA in Rachon Ora, and the guard, my wife said, he's at the Shivik Tana, he's at the Shivik girls, the boys, we see him all over town. He goes everywhere to be a guard. Fantastic. He's an entrepreneurial guard. Great. So if a person has disclosure, so then you get out of the pile problem. Okay? Continues the Gemara. We have to do this Rashi. It's an amazing story. Ramallah Rav Mary Breda Rav Shmuel. Rav Mary has the question. I see we're a little short on time. Rav Mary says he's the daughter of Shmuel. So we'll just finish this Rashi. Rashi tells us who is he? Why are you calling Rav Mary the son of the daughter of Shmuel? Right. So this comes up throughout Shas. We find about the daughters of Shmuel. So Rashi says correlated by Rachel. Sometimes it's called by Rachel, by Shmuel, right? Or the son of the daughter of Shmuel. What happened? Brachot was the daughter of Shmuel. V'nish beis l'ben Amnon. She was taken as a hostage, a captive. And she became pregnant. Eventually, he became converted, and his name was Isser. Basra. Mary braid harasa shlebek dusha have. However, when he became pregnant, right, it was a situation where the father wasn't Jewish. Therefore, he wasn't called in Chas by the name of his father, and rather he was called by the name of his mother. The going back to Shmuel. So let's just finish this quickly. So Rami le Rav Mary brother Rav Shmuel le Rava. So he asked the question to Rava. The workers, they are reading at the top of the tree or the pile of stones. They're able to say the Shema. Alma, what do you see from that loy boy kavana? But Vermin ask you a steer. I carry Shema tzar shnechav and a sliboy shenemar Shema Yisrael. But I ask you a steer. We say that somebody reading the Shema, the Bryce says you have to have kavana. Shenemar Shema Yisrael. Later on, it's going to tell us the pasuk that we just had yesterday. Haskes Shema Yisrael. Pay attention and listen. Right? It's not just simply hear. Pay attention. Right? Just like you have Haskes or Shema Yisrael as it relates to, as we said yesterday, about the Torah and other things. So you should have Haskes over here, just like over there. You're going to say Haskes or Shema Yisrael. So here where it says Shema Yisrael, you should also have Haskes, like a Gzer Sheva type of thing. So you should also pay attention. You should also have Kavana. So how could it be that you're allowing the workers to be saying the Shema on top of the tree or the pile of stones? They're not having Kavana. Even if they're able to say it, you clearly see that you're supposed to have an element of Kavana, which is going to be lacking because they're on the top of the tree. So Ishtik, Rava is quiet. So Amalei Midi, so Rava asked for Mary. She says, did you hear anything about this? I'm like, I heard Rav Shesha said this. The following, that they are actually going to be bottom from the malacha when they're going to say the Shema. They're going to be Mivata Malacha when they say, in other words, they can't just simply be working when they're doing it. They have to stop working in order to be able to be reading the Shema. It says Rashi, we did, in fact, give them permission to mivato from their work in order to say over the Shema. We should just do quickly the couple of Taisasin before we're done. So Taisa says Ma'aser Rabbi Gamliel. So we just had the story of Rabbi Gamliel in the Mishnah. So Taisa says, listen, the story of Rabbi Gamliel is not changing the halacha. Again, this is the halacha before the Shulchan Aruch. A Chatan who was marrying on the first night didn't have to say the Shema. He didn't have to, because he wasn't able to have kavanah. So you have the story of Rabbi Gamliel. So you might think this is a Maisa Lister, that the story of Rabbi Gamliel is coming to change the halacha. Then in fact it's disagreeing that you really don't have to do it. Says the Taisus, no, it's not a Maisa Lister. A lot of Maisa Lister. The Kamashvanim Godalu by Teach Ba'atzmai Sheyachal Iskavein V'Roy Litos Hashem or Shos B'Yadai. Anybody who can say that they can have kavanah, then of course they're allowed to do so, like Rabbi Gamliel. So it's not a Maisa Lister, it is in fact just confirming what we've already said. And then we said that the Baal Bas is not able to say the Shema, it says Taisvis, Visha ain't died to be Shava Salav. So Frek Taisvis, in terms of typically Mishum Daminu Le'el Lo Yama Adam become Gevaya V'Yispal. Taisvis asks, but we already learned before that he's supposed to go, Mimamakim Kirasicha, he's supposed to go down. So maybe the reason that you shouldn't be doing this is because you're too high. Yeshlemer answers Taisvis, doesn't matter, I got Bekisa Safsel. But somebody standing up on a chair or a table. But a tree could be considered like an aliyah. And we know that there's no problem with saying Shema if you're in an aliyah. If you're in the second floor, that's not going to be an issue. Fine, we'll continue the Gemara tomorrow. Here,